Okay, hello. Hopefully we're streaming live now. Excellent, I'm getting some nods that we're coming through. Welcome back to the APL Broadcasting Towers, which is, as you know, my office in the glamorous confines of the architecture building here at Newcastle University. And this is the final public conversation of our I don't know what you'd call this really. I guess it's our COVID semester, really. So it's offered us some amazing opportunities, this, to move our conversations and move our public programs online, which has really allowed us to reach out and connect with a whole group of different speakers and different contributors from across the world in ways that we never would have done before. So I suppose we've got some things to be thankful for to the tiny non-human organism that has caused a lot of our troubles. Before we start today, I would like to really warmly thank Ali and Sarah, who are here on the screen with us. Ali and Sarah have been the engine behind the vehicle of the public programs this year and have tirelessly sat there looking deeply nervous when a YouTube link isn't ready to go and highly alarmed when the little box that should be blue is grey. And I see the fear in the eye, Sarah, because I've been there and I know it very well. And Ali has been fantastic in organising all the sort of back end stuff in terms of getting our contributors paid and how they can work with us over here. A lot of complexity that has been really, really gratefully received. So thank you so much for your contributions this year. And we'll look forward to working with you and taking it into next semester. And, you know, maybe COVID light, maybe COVID heavy, we don't know. But yeah, thanks, Ali and Sarah. That's really appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I think we're going to move over to the gallery mode for Kate and I. Okay, grand. Will that go to gallery? So hopefully we should lose the speakers. Or if we go to speaker view, Sarah, then hopefully we should get a slightly better broadcast view, I hope. Okay, well, I'm going to run with that as it goes. And hopefully that will work. And we won't have two speaker names there. So really pleased today to welcome Kate Wagner to In Conversation. Kate is joining us from across the Atlantic, broadcasting out of Chicago, I believe. And Kate, you're an architectural critic, architectural and cultural critic, and curator of the sort of pretty well-known blog McMansion Hell, that takes no prisoners in search of a critique of I guess mostly the US's popular large-scale private homes. Is it mostly US, Kate?
Yeah, it's mostly the US, I would say. Okay. Though actually, interestingly enough, all of the Anglophone countries have McMansions. Yeah. Australia has McMansions, Canada has McMansions, Britain has McMansions, at least in some places, though they're sort of more tame than the American ones. The American ones are truly exceptional, but it's fascinating how they exist. It's a very Anglophone phenomenon.
Yeah. I think one that we all know we can probably see somewhere around our neighbourhoods. What I like about your description, I'm just cribbing from Kate's description of what she does, her bio, that you thoroughly examine the phenomenon as the McMansion. I really like that. You do. There are a lot of arrows and diagrams on McMansion Hell that help us to understand some of the more intricate design moves that happen within these structures. And use it, I like what you say, use it as a tool for architecture education and humorous cultural remarks. There is no shortage of humour either, which seems very important in a sense. But Kate, you're also a writer and a critic for numerous publications. Actually, most recently, the one that I encountered before organising this with you was the Architectural Review, where you wrote a very beautiful letter to a young architect, as the issue had in it, kind of, I guess, encouraging or thinking through a form of criticism or a role of the critic that seems really important. But also for the Baffler, the Atlantic, City Lab, and The Nation. And are you still an opinions columnist at Curbed?
No, I'm actually now the architecture critic at the New Republic.
Okay.
I have a print column that runs every other issue in that magazine. And the latest column will be going out in I think this month's issue, and it's about Trump's presidential library. So that should be fun.
Yeah, okay. That's going to be the forthcoming architectural events of the decade, isn't it?
Yeah.
The presidential library.
Exit through the gift shop.
Exit and enter through the gift shop, surely.
Okay.
So, Kate, I guess you would, in some senses, term yourself a professional critic. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I would say so. Especially in recent years, where I feel like my work has been legitimated quite a bit after I started writing as a columnist at Curbed. That was like 2 or 3 years ago. That really solidified a lot of my thoughts on American consumerism and popular architecture. And then my work was sort of further legitimated by becoming a print columnist on architecture, which is a relatively scarce job these days. And that I had a column created for me in a major magazine to write about design, which was, I mean, I can't even describe how that feels. It was really just when I got the call, do you want to be a critic here at the New Republic on contract a year ago, I was really stunned because there are very few print architecture critics left in the world, but especially in the US. There's fewer than 10, I would say. In the whole country. So that's a relatively small group of people working still in that medium, which is a traditional medium of criticism, and reaching a wide audience through general publications like newspapers, like magazines, like the New Republic, for example. So it's a huge privilege, and I'm thankful for it.
Fantastic. And I guess this is a really good way of ending the series that we've had. So I was thinking about this the other day, and so we began this series of talks this year with a conversation with our professor of cities here, Roger Burrows, who was speaking about the implications of technology, the rise of populism and politics, both on the built environment and also sort of imaginaries of the built environment. So we were sort of looking quite closely at how that operated from a bit more of, I guess, a kind of an academic, slightly distanced lens. And then we moved into, in our last conversation with Amy Linford and Finn Williams of Public Practice, the ways that an architecture and sort of urban group try to find ways of working with the popular or popular will or popular ideas that would act with a sense of nuance as well, and kind of bring out the latent politics of a place, but also trying to kind of do that in a sense of affecting a form of change. So they're starting to kind of work at an architectural space. And I guess now we're moving into this final conversation with yourself, Kate, where really we're talking with somebody that is very active on the platform of social media, using it as a critic, using it to kind of take quite a sharp aim at quite a lot of architectural tropes, design tropes that you've sort of aimed and directed your critical gaze at. And I guess in that role of a professional critic, that's pretty essential to take that post. But what I want to just quickly start with, Kate, is something that you said to me just in conversation just now, that nobody ever asks you what you like as a critic. You're saying that people only ever ask you, what do you hate? What's the awful thing? Tell us something terrible. What do you actually like? What do you enjoy? What do you love?
It's funny to me that so much of criticism, or what people like about criticism, is that you can be mean and you can be funny and sassy and whatnot. But ultimately for me, I find criticism to be what I call sort of an act of love. It's something that I practice because I want architecture to be better, because I love architecture. It's one of the first loves in my life. And I find that for me, I mean, of course, like historically, my academic research was in late modernism, specifically within the realm of the performing arts. And so I have like a great love actually of concert halls from the 1970s, which are not great concert halls, but they're fascinating formal studies. My favorite buildings from that era. I mean, I love, like, for example, like not the 70s, but the 60s, like the Berlin Philharmonie, for example, probably my favorite building on earth. But as terms of like current practice, for me, I am really fond of architects who are working with sort of politically sensitive topics, specifically housing, like Peter Barber, for example, and also Lacaton and Vessel in France, doing refurbishments of public housing there, which goes to show you that you can build for the civic and for the public realm, and for something as sensitive as housing in a way that is beautiful and engages with the community and is playful too in a way, and also sort of accentuates the fact that we, as inhabitants of space, make our space. We appropriate that space, to borrow a term from Henri Lefebvre, and it enables that to show through in a way that I find to be, quite lovely, and I find to be also politically radical, to say, yes, we have control over the public realm and we can make it beautiful. It doesn't have to be, cheap or shoddy or what have you. It can be, livable, and and of course also in terms of the US, sort of my favorite practices are still sort of, for example, Lake Flato in Texas, doing sustainability work where there's a big emphasis on the integration of the landscape and the ecology of a site with its material choice and with its with its program. They do a lot of botanical gardens, for example, which of course I'm fond of. And so those are sort of the architects that I always sort of return to now that are in contemporary practice. And what I like. And of course, also everyone knows that I love brutalism, but for better or for worse.
Well, if I could just turn your attention to one thing that you, I don't know if you like it or dislike it, or if that's not really a relevant category, but certainly one thing that you've turned your critical eye to, your people use the term acerbic wit, maybe that's something that's applicable in this context, but is a paper, well, not a paper, but an article you wrote that I really enjoyed. I'm just going to hold it up to the camera for the title of it. Corona grifting, a design phenomenon. Corona grifting. Can I just show the host has disabled screen sharing. Can I ask our hosts at home, Sarah and Ali, can you enable screen sharing for me? Because I want to quickly show a couple of examples of corona grifting. Can you make me a co-host, please? I've got to get the co-hosting. Let's see if I can do that once I'm co-hosted. Because I just wanted to show the viewers at home a couple of examples of what you speak about in terms of corona grifting. Because I think this is something that you mention in relationship to ideas of a kind of form of architecture that you come on to call PR architecture, public relations architecture. I still don't have screen sharing. I wonder if guys at home can give me, Ali or Sarah, could you give me screen sharing, please? Let's see, screen sharing. I'll put a note in the chat. It's one of the technical vagaries that we have in this way of working. I wasn't a host on this. But the idea of corona grifting seems to be something that you've really kind of taken quite a sharp focus on, where you bring our attention to the way that this pandemic has suddenly brought designers in a will to solve and to sort of solutioneer. Is that a term? Solutioneering?
It should be.
It should be. I've made it a term if it isn't. I can't yet screen share, which is going to be a slight limitation on that. But maybe you could tell us what you mean by corona grifting whilst we wait for that to happen, Kate.
Yeah, it's interesting. So of course, like when the coronavirus first happened, everyone was in a panic, and there was sort of this immediate sort of need to turn the whole thing into a big public art project, or a big sort of, we at Firm have solutions at the intersection of X and Y for this problem. And some of it was cute, Like, for example, there were like hula hoop-esque outfits involved in maintaining social distancing, where you would put a big like cage around yourself to enforce the 6-foot diameter, which is like, okay, that's somewhat twee, but a lot of it was I think rather dark. There were proposals like, here's how we turn airports into hospitals, and of course it was sort of one of these things where everyone's decided in sort of the design world to just create basically like a really easy 3D render of some solution to this problem of the coronavirus, whether it's at the sort of intersection of social distancing or how to like provide more hospital beds or whatever. But none of these projects were ever going to come to fruition, is the thing. And I think that was really it's like, yes, so the point of it was, we can say that we at design firm we care about this issue and we're doing something to better the world during these trying times. But really, in reality, what was happening was people were creating really easy renderings and getting airtime at blogs like Design or Design Boom, for example, where they can get their firm's name in these publications that have become so central to architectural image making. And so they get to look like they're doing something to help the world without ever having to really do anything else besides create renderings. Because it's not like they're legitimate requests for proposals, for example, where they're working with something tangible in the world to produce something that will exist physically. It's sort of like paper architecture, but more cynical, which is a sort of a point that I make in the article that I think a lot about. Of course, my area of academic expertise is the 70s. And so I think often about the paper architecture of the 70s, like Archigram, for example, and how there was, of course, like a sort of tongue-in-cheekness to that sort of utopianism, but at the same time, there was a broader critique and a broader sort of understanding of society. Whereas with P architecture, it's very much like the issue du jour becomes an opportunity for grandstanding, and you get to look very good and like you really care. And I think and my critique of that is that, like, I'm not here to sort of restrict creativity or like to prevent people from thinking of like interesting solutions to sort of the problems that have arisen from the coronavirus. But my problem is that what really sort of is happening here is that we're taking a public health crisis that's caused like immense amounts of death and suffering, and using it to promote your architecture firm or your design firm or your graduate student project or whatever. And that to me is deeply cynical. And I find it to be in poor taste. And I think that while some of the ideas are well-intentioned, of course, most of them I feel are opportunistic at best and tone deaf at worst. And so it's something that it just rubbed me the wrong way. And to the point where I saw these things happening on Twitter every day, like these plexiglass, bubbles or whatever that people wearable bubbles, or where I got to the point where it's like, I have to say something about this. This is really just bothering the hell out of me. And so that article sort of kicked off a line of thinking that evolved into sort of the P architecture concepts, which I've sort of been harping on, I guess, for the last 6 months.
So I still can't quite get the technology to work. So I've found I'm gonna do a manual workaround. I'm gonna hold my laptop up to the screen, and maybe people can see that. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see that? So that's an artist that proposed these series of kind of interventions for face masks as a way, I guess, of what you would be suggesting. If I just show you the next one, so any kind of household items. That first one was a lettuce. That is what looks to be a nappy or some equivalent. You've also got, so this came out right at the beginning of the pandemic. So where is it? COVID hats. So social distancing hats. I believe Burger King had a version of this.
Yeah,
that you talk
Burger
about.
King.
So sort of enormous hat. You also take aim right at the Penda coronavirus fashion bubble suit as well. that maybe people can see if I hold that up to the camera. You see the bubble suits, absolutely amazing, right? You know, and what I guess you're suggesting, so we'll wait and see if I can get some technology working with the co-hosting, the screen share. Still not yet, but I'll have to keep on doing the manual crossover then, so this is going to be fun. What you're kind of suggesting in there then is that those forms of design or even art, in a sense, are cynically manipulating what is a major public health crisis in order to sort of sell an idea of something. Is that right?
Yeah, that you're on the vanguard of whatever is happening in current affairs. And I think that for me, I mean, just think about it, right? Like, this is something that people are losing their jobs. People are losing their health insurance in the US, for example. People are dying. People are lonely and isolated and sad, and have been in this country at least for like almost an entire year. And you're just like some artist, like being like, what if we made giant silly hats about this? I mean, it just, I don't know. It strikes me as being, like I said, tone deaf. It's something that if you want to create, for example, like legitimate solutions to this problem, what you do either is, and I'm not ever one to like, you know, commend, you know, like Starchitects or whatever, but some Starchitects have devoted some of their like 3D printing, manufacturing, sort of in-house stuff to making masks for first responders when this first happened. And it's like, yeah, you did that to get attention, but also like that has a material benefit that's actually doing something in the world.
Yeah.
But if that's, you know, and if that's fine if they want to do that, like, even if it's just for good attention, you know, no such thing as bad publicity. But at the same time, you know, if you want to do something like just create like a mock-up of a face shield or something like that and being like, this is going to change everything. It's just, you know, if you really want to change things, you have to do something that has an effect on the sort of on the material world, on the world that exists outside of the computer screen and outside of the image. And that's really like sort of what I take issue with, because that work is often not glamorous. The work of actually providing for communities and for actually, you know, helping people get through this isn't going to look good on a page. I mean, it's not going to look good on Dezeen. It's a matter of like being a responsible citizen, for one, staying inside, or for example, or not going to massive parties. But it's also a matter of, you know, putting your resources in or allocating your resources in a way that actually helps people. And so, of course, there are people who do that, and there are people like first responders, and there are people like the people working on the vaccine, or there are people who were working in the sort of nameless people who worked on, you know, making sure that hospitals were prepared for these inundations. And those are things that, you know, also take place in the world and within the built environment. And the separation, I think, of what I guess you would say like the real world from the architecture world, I think really comes out in the sort of corona grifting thing. Is like that, like, while other people take these approaches that are very active and very much, like I said, in the world, architecture is making images instead. And that's my issue.
And you counterpoise this to what we would have seen as paper architecture back in the 1960s as kind of a profoundly, well, in some senses you suggest a profoundly different form of architecture. But a kind of related way of gaming the system, I guess you see it as. So you talk about people like Instagram, Archigram, Super Studio, some of the sort of metabolists in you know, Japan, the sort of enormous superstructural proposals that never really left the page. And in a way, you kind of relate the contemporary version of that back to those more imaginative, potentially more utopian forms of architecture that we might have seen.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because for me, paper architecture is like wonderful and beautiful because it is impossible. And also it's not saleable if you think about it. Like, you know, the Walking City, right, like famous Archigram project, like that was, of course, never going to be built or constructed. And same thing with the Metabolists, and Super Studio doing like very humorous collage art is also something that's, you know, sort of within that whimsical and imaginary realm. And those those projects were meant to examine broader issues of, for example, with metabolism, urbanization, and density, and population growth, and with Archigram with consumption, and with Super Studio, the sort of analysis of like horizontal space, for example. And so I think that with those, they ask bigger architectural questions. And even if they were utopian, there's like a sort of inherently critical element to them. I think like of Archizoom's No Stop City, for example, which is both a like embrace of consumption and a critique of it at the same time, and also involves a lot of nudity, which is something that does not exist in these new proposals. Very much the 70s. And so for me, with the P architecture, the sort of difference is that everything with P architecture is saleable in some way. It's not necessarily about asking these big questions about the city or about consumption or about sort of utopia or dystopia, crowds and isolation. It's about asking these questions. It's not even asking questions. It's like, we at design firm have a solution at the intersection of X and Y for these problems. Everything is very, it's all about selling something. Whether you're selling your services as a firm, as image makers, as architecture makers, or you're selling, for example, like an idea of like, oh, like 3D printed houses. That's to solve homelessness. Like that's something you can buy. That's something that you can commission. Like, oh, and it's always something that can be produced or replicated in some way for either like the attention economy or the real world economy. And so when you are restricted to that, because like that's the point of what you're doing, which is to get attention for your firm in some way, it stops yourself from asking like the bigger questions that paper architecture asks, and what made it so fun and whimsical. And I think that I take issue with that, and I think that you know, the 60s and the 70s weren't exactly, you know, a placid time in world history. There was a lot of tumultuous stuff going on all around the world, and lots of big questions that had to be asked, especially with regard to the city, and with regard to like accepting and integrating into like a rapidly changing or shifting industrial modernity. And we are at that same sort of threshold now, that same sort of liminal space between changing economies, between, you know, like a information-based and a service-based economy. And like, we have to ask those same questions about housing, about climate resiliency, about all these other things. And instead of getting these sort of, you know, big picture sort of plans or questions or movements, I mean, actual movements with multiple architects working together with a common vision, we just get these isolated firms, each promoting their own like small saleable utopia. And it's like a utopia that that can be yours for $19.95, $19.95. You know, it's by calling Bjarke Ingels and company. Like, and so, yeah, I think that's a very marked difference between our current periods. And that's why I call it cynical. Even if like, you know, Archigram was tongue in cheek, I don't think it was necessarily cynical in the same way as like Bjarke Ingels' Floating City is cynical.
So I still can't screen share. We're still slightly technologically stymied a bit due to certain rights of access that I don't currently have. So I'm going to have to do another manual screen share. So if I just hold that back up to the camera, hopefully people can see. So there's Ron Heron's. Is that coming through? Can you see that all right if I hold it up?
I can see it, yeah. That's Walking City.
So that's Ron Heron's Walking City. So that's what you're sort of referring to in the senses of the paper architecture of the 60s and 70s. It's being this thing that sort of almost had this utopian idea that was in a way that wasn't as bound into the marketization of the architectural object or the architectural form, right? That's the sort of position you're suggesting. And then if we contrast that with, so this is Oceanics, and Oceanics they're not just an imaginary world, they're a real company, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
This is Oceanics website. And this is what BIG, Bjarke Ingels Group, have been working on and designing. So this sort of floating world of housing and living that you can be within to escape the coming apocalypse. to kind of get out of the world, really. And it's really interesting because it relates back to what we were talking about with Roger Burrows at the start of this, as this sort of exit, this culture or this space of exit. So rather than working within the world and looking to transform it and change it with what we have, there's a sort of overriding idea from, and what Roger was speaking about in relationship to sort of neo-reactionary politics, an idea of exiting, so leaving. And he was talking about that in relationship to seasteading, so the Seasteading Institute, which is, this institute that's tied to quite far right sort of neo-reactionary radical ideas, and interestingly funded by Peter Thiel, the ex or founder of PayPal. So, there's a huge amount of money bound up in these things in a way that it wasn't with the walking cities and with the sort of utopian architectural forms of the past. I think it certainly seems to be disconnected somehow. And it seems that that there are more, the ethics as well become a little bit different. I really enjoyed reading so I was taking this from Wait, It Won't, which I guess, is that your title from that?
I guess that's the title they gave it, yeah.
Opinion, no PR architecture won't save us from the pandemic. And I particularly enjoyed your bringing out of BIG's architecture speak for describing that Oceanics site, saying, we've based it on this modular idea of a hexagonal island. It has the omnidirection of a circle. I love that, an omnidirection of a circle. That's brilliant. But has the modularity and rationality of something man-made. Rationality. We must always come back to securing our rationality, for we are rational beings.
Yes.
Potentially. Which I think is really fascinating. But I suppose what you also talk about in there is the way that these forms of architectural representation, really, because that's what they are currently, right? They're not.
Yeah, they're not projects that are going to exist in the world, and likely never will. Okay,
so they're not there. They're not in existence. So their existence is on the page or on the screen, really. It sits on what we've been speaking about in some aspects throughout this conversation and the earlier conversation with Roger Burrows. is the medium, and we're all good McLuhanians, aren't we?
It's just good. Yeah.
We've all got to come back to Marshall McLuhan, and we all know still that looking at the content of the thing is not half as valuable as looking at the form that the content is distributed on and transmitted on. That the VHS tells us more about what's on the VHS tape recorder than the actual television program you might have recorded in the 80s. And in a sense, we can see the same thing here, that really the medium that these architectural images are communicated and conveyed upon is the medium of network technology, is the medium of high-speed, decentralized network communications, also known as the internet to people that aren't in the ivory towers of the university. So the medium upon which these images sit drives a certain use of them, doesn't it, I guess? And the thing that you talking about in here, you come back to, is that it's sort of on, and I think you mentioned it earlier, it's on this idea of the affective or the attention economy, that they kind of sit on a platform where there's a need to grasp an attention, because by grasping an attention, you hold on to your viewer's eyes, you hold on to their finger on the mouse or the keypad or the screen, which enables clicks, which enables capital, really. So is what you're suggesting, what we're seeing, a kind of a much closer interweaving, really, of the medium and then the content that's presented on there, the architectural object, if you like.
I mean, certainly, I think that's true. And of course, I mean, this is why you sort of see, I guess maybe perhaps this is not the correct term, but the hegemony of the render as the glossy render as the tool du jour of architectural communication. Because we allow ourselves to, the rendering allows architects to present a, sorry, I got distracted by the chat, sort of like an almost cinematic or perception of it's not like a drawing, it's not like a representational or abstracted thing. The rendering is very much meant to be like, this is what this will look like in the real world. And that gives it a sort of legitimacy that like a drawing doesn't necessarily have, because the drawing, again, is still abstracted, is still something that's very much, again, of its medium. But the rendering blurs the line to me between sort of like a reality, a virtual reality, and and it makes like a potential reality sort of easier to perceive, if that makes sense. And so much of this has been legitimatized or legitimated by the render and by these blogs like Dezeen, like Design Boom, like Instagram, platforms like that, where it's so much about like the image and the images have to look good, and they have to be glossy, and they have to be exciting. Everything has to be exciting. It can't, so much of the actual work of architecture is drudgery. You're talking about wall sections, for example, or like diagrams of insulation or HVAC or whatever. So much of it is actually the drudgery of getting something built in the real world. And that's not exciting. That doesn't like say this is the future to people, even though like architecture is a thing that exists in the world in a very specific material context. But so we have these renderings, we have these platforms that exemplify like sort of the glamour of architecture, even though it's architecture that doesn't get built. And this sort of furthers the idea this in architecture of sort of the lone creative genius solving problems, solving the world's problems. Whether or not it gets built or is irrelevant. You're producing something that says we care. You're producing something that says we have the power within our little firm or big firm to render utopia real, at least in the image. And that gets clicks. It's exciting. It's exciting when someone says we're going to build a floating city to solve climate change. It's not exciting to talk about like the actual sort of policy that's necessary for combating climate change. That's not glamorous. But saying that you're going to build a floating city, like that's glamorous, that's exciting. That sounds like something that's out of a science fiction novel. We can sell that, we can sell our name, we can sell our brand. It's going to end up on all the big design blogs because you're a big firm and everything you do is news. And so it's very easy to look very forward thinking without actually having building things. And the thing about building things is that once something exists in the real world, it opens itself up to criticism in a way that an image doesn't. Because we have these constant, that's part of the platforms too. We have these constant flows of images, constantly like new posts on Dezeen, constant new things to scroll through on Instagram, Pinterest, etc. I mean, it's a constant flow of content that you're just inundated with day after day after day after day after day. And so like it allows none of these ideas to stick particularly or become particularly memorable or long lasting. They're fleeting. And that's part of the nature of the media itself, because social media just happens at the speed of light. And that's and creating relevancy or like proposing solutions that are longer term is just antithetical to that media, which is so constantly about the new and the exciting and whatnot. And making meaning out of that is difficult. I mean, and it becomes just basically an attempt to secure attention and to secure one's place within that media sphere, which is just a part of the activities of the firm nowadays. It's just the same as it was to try to talk to a publicist at House Beautiful, for example, back in the 1950s. It's very much a major part of a firm's work is this kind of outreach, this kind of social media, this kind of image making and selling. And I mean, I think that's detrimental to architecture, obviously, but it's, you know, it's also detrimental to criticism. What are we supposed to do as the critic when we're constantly inundated with images and proposals and whatnot that these other sites like Dezeen, like Design Boom, like Instagram, they take at face value that like this is a legitimate idea that's in the world, and through the lens of publishing that appears relatively legitimate, it gives it a sort of, what I'm trying to find the word that I'm looking for here, but it gives it an air, like I said, of legitimacy, that it's real architecture that's happening. And when you're the critic, you know, you can't possibly respond to all of these things that are constantly on your feed, that are on your page. And that's very different from sort of the slow media of the past. For example, like, you know, back in, you know, the, you know, 1960s when you had print architecture critics, you could like a new building was built in New York and you would visit it and you would interview the architect, and your word had meaning as a critic in terms of like how that building was perceived by the public or interpreted by the public, and architects feared you and respected you. And you know, there's no place really for the critic in the current architectural media economy, unless you take, for example, like with the corona grifting thing, a broad range attack at a phenomenon that's sort of congealed enough that you can say like this phenomenon that's happening is, you know, is tone deaf and useless. Or you can say, or you have to critique the medium itself, which is to some extent, you know, an architecture critic's job, but to another extent is really enters the realm of media studies or cultural criticism. And so these lines that used to be clearly demarcated in terms of the role of the critic are really quite blurred now if you want to sort of take a stand against things. And it's a constant battle, essentially. And it ends up reinforcing in a backwards way the kind of starchitecture paradigm that we have, because when something massive gets built by like some big architect, that's what people are excited about. Like that's how the general public knows about architecture, because like some famous guy did it. And so you, the critic, are roped into talking about that. And it's a self-reinforcing prophecy that like these same people get attention all the time, and we don't have the power anymore to sort of highlight the new voices in the media in the mediums that they deserve. And it's really kind of a wicked problem. I don't necessarily know if I have the solution to that, but the medium is certainly the message, but it's also the problem.
Yeah,
it's a long way of saying that.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, and I mean maybe one that we can just sort of not in a moment finish on. But it seems that partly what you've been doing has also been sort of surfing that medium to some extent with your relationship and your work on McMansion Hell. You know, there is an involvement and engagement in what the medium does. It's proliferation of images. You know, the way that you can kind of communicate across that platform. So in a sense, you're not yourself divorced from the medium. You're sort of surfing.
Oh, embedded within it. Yeah.
Embedded. But just before that, let's just turn our attention to one space where there's been quite a literal, and actually it seems like an extremely literal manifestation of something that was an image that's now become built. I'm just going to do it. So I've got screen sharing. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for sorting out that problem we had in the background there. So hopefully you should be able to see this. So this is the vessel.
Good.
And as you say, Kate, the vessel is a perfect name for the 16-story monument nestled in the midst of the now complete neighborhood, in inverted commas, of Hudson Yards, New York City. So this is the vessel. This is Thomas Heatherwick, who also interestingly designed one of his earliest projects here in Newcastle, a site called the Blue Carpet that's outside.
Oh, I know that project.
Do you know that project? That is now distinctly grey.
Yeah.
Distinctly grey about a year after its completion, which is interesting in its own right. Yeah. But this is in New York. This is the vessel, which I guess is a sort of public monument of sorts. It's a vertical walking platform thing. I mean, I don't actually I realize I don't have a term for it. I don't really have. What would you call it, Kate? What is it?
Yeah, I would call it a public monument, I suppose. A bauble.
Bubble. Well, some people have called it. What was my favorite one that I highlighted was the malevolent shawarma.
That's my favorite one too. I also like the evil pine cone. That's another good one. Pine cone,
which, you know, we should also just indicate these are certainly not the views of the university here. These are just some of the terms that we are enjoying currently that they're called. But what's particularly interesting about this, and this is a render that we're looking at, but it doesn't really matter actually, does it? Because in many extents, the render and the image have become completely blurred in this relationship, because what you talk about in here is an interestingly controversial story about how photographs that were taken in here, and it should be noted that this is private land, right? Hudson Yards is private development, and this is a privately owned structure that looks out onto high-end luxury residences. And I believe, sort of reading your article, that there was a point in time then. So if you're taking a photograph at the top of here, that photograph would have been the property of the developer. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah. So you had this thing where, you know, if you've gone here, you take a photograph of this on your smartphone, you know, you're kind of get embedded in an ownership of that image by a developer. They relented on that, so they now just have the right to circulate that image on social media. But I suppose what's really interesting here is the convergence between the architectural object as a kind of physical thing, and then the depiction of that object on the medium of social media, or on the sort of platform across interconnected networks of global communication. Because you get both the object that stands there and does something, but in a sense, the object really is a stand-in, oddly, in a really odd way to get your head around this. The object is a stand-in for the picture of the object.
Yes.
You know? So it doesn't matter. The object itself doesn't matter that much.
No. Well, so much of the vessel's existence is just for taking pictures on. And when I visited, it was interesting because, first of all, there are parts of it that are sort of already falling apart, like the railings and glass panels, but also because everyone there on that structure was taking a picture of some sort, had a selfie stick, or had someone else take a picture, or they were taking a picture of the view. Like, it was all about, the whole purpose of the vessel was as a vessel for imagery. And it's fascinating to me that people like would go there, not because it's like an interesting architectural monument, but because it looks good in pictures. And you would have, like, for example, when I visited, you had people with like influencers, like in full makeup and full fashion, with like their own photographers, like standing in front of the vessel. And so it was just this strange experience of being on this structure that is like ostensibly an architectural experience, but really everyone around you is just taking pictures of themselves or of and you see it like in this photo, like everyone's like got the camera out. It's really wild. And I feel like there's some sort of significant threshold here where it's like we really are creating architecture for image making. And that is the actual program really of this structure. Because what other program is there besides walking upstairs? Like, what does it do? It doesn't do any, it's not even interactive or engaging. It doesn't ask any questions, and it doesn't even pretend to ask any questions. It's literally there for image making. And I find that to be like rather dark in like a Black Mirror kind of way. But at the same time, I find it to be fascinating because it just goes to show you that these technological and social changes that have happened over the last 10, 20 years have now have built permanent architectural representation, and are embedded in a very visible way in the built environment. And I find that to be utterly fascinating. It's like, for example, the Museum of Ice Cream is another one. Like when I was in New York, the Museum of Ice Cream is exactly what it sounds like. It's just like pastel dripping, like immersive rooms. And it's basically used for people to take Instagram photos in. And when I was walking with my husband the last time we were in New York, and we passed the Museum of Ice Cream, and there's a line like winding all around the street full of people in like their best like streetwear clothes, like lining up to take pictures inside, Instagram pictures inside of this building, which again, I just think is fascinating. And maybe this is because, I mean, but also I'm 27. It's not like I am, separated age-wise from like the kinds of like people who are doing this. Like a lot of them are the same age as I am. But I fundamentally just don't understand it. And I find it to be rather dark. But at the same time, I mean, you have to ask, does it really hurt anyone? Is it just strange that we're seeing these shifts in media, these shifts in consumption, these shifts in architecture? Is it really harmful, or is it to like the individual, to the people who inhabit space? Yep, that's it.
That's your Museum of Ice Cream. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I guess it's maybe kind of comes back to the question of what, in a sense, or what type of economy these forms of architectures and architectural object as image operate within. And you were talking about the previous example about the vessel, in your article. Can I swear online? I'm going to say F***K, the vessel, just in case I'm in trouble for that. You talking there about how it's intimately related to real estate as well, and this is another theme that we've been exploring here, is how real estate is related to technology and related to, in many senses, an increasing understanding of the value of real estate through technological processes. So the valuation of real estate through the algorithm, which can tell us, what the likelihood is of the generation that are going to go and occupy this space and consume ice cream and experience here. But it also sees the use and the depiction of the image of these sites as a component of the valuation of them as well. And you say, talking about the vessel, it is an object lesson teaching us that in our neoliberal age of surveillance capitalism, an era where the human spirit is subjected to a regime of means testing and digital disruption, and a cynical view of the city as an engine of real estate prevails, architecture, quite frankly, sucks. Which is, again, is not sort of putting too fine a point on it, is it, as a critic? But for me, it's that the cynical view of the city as an engine of real estate, and that's how I would perceive these things functioning in many senses. So the image production of the vessel, which both produces an image of itself, as well as requiring images to then be produced of it for distribution and circulation on all the platforms we've spoken about, acts to actively increase the real estate value. So its function as a monument is, again, maybe secondary or even tertiary to its value, to its function in increasing value on real estate, which is another sort of fascinating turn of the architectural object, really.
I agree. I mean, also, if you think about, going back to maybe perhaps not the vessel, but, the McMansion, so much of the production of the McMansion is linked, as an architectural form, is linked intimately with the financialization of real estate during the period leading up to the Great Recession. I mean, those houses look that way, like all garbled and strange, because they had to occupy, or they had to contain, a certain number of architectural signifiers for saleability. I mean, it was so much of this was just informed by media during that era. If you look at like House Hunters, for example, on HGTV, like the folks like who are on that show, like had like these signifiers that they had to have. It's like, it needs to have marble countertops, or it has to have like 5 bedrooms, or it has to have, a fireplace or a great room or space for entertaining. And these became sort of baubles to collect. And the more baubles you had, the more your house was worth. And it was just sort of this endless like arms race of having as many features. You had to have a theater room. You had to have formal dining room. You had to have an open floor plan. And it just became more and more and more and more, because each of those figures increased the saleability of your house. And so much was based on the buying and selling and consumption of real estate, or the consumption of houses through like, of course, like these predatory lending programs, but also it was a cultural shift. It was not only just a financial shift in terms of like how we buy and sell houses in America, but it was a cultural shift in the home, less being about like consumption inside the home as it was, for example, at mid-century, but more about consumption of the home itself. And also like the building of a house specifically to accrue a number of disparate signifiers of wealth, or signifiers of leisure, or sort of the recreation of the public realm, for example, the movie theater or the bar within the home. This really speaks to a sort of like ex-urban, suburban isolationism in America, where you have to recreate the public sphere at home, which I guess now is an advantage where we all live at home, but it's still rather funny to me.
In your interior.
Yeah. It is, and the reason the houses look like this, the reason why they have these like insane roof lines, is because there's very little attention paid to the actual form making of the house, aside from like the lawyer foyer, for example, which is just yet another signifier to show like we have a really big foyer, we have a really big grand entryway, and our house is designed to impress. And so it's something to me that like the roof lines look like that because of sloppy allocations of service routing, or storage, or odd sloping ceilings because you wanted wall dormers. I mean, really, there's no real internal logic to it, aside from the collection of signifiers of wealth. And so that has formal implications for the house, for the McMansion as a form of high-end vernacular architecture. And so that's what's fascinating to me about all of this, is that the real estate economy and the financialization of housing has ramifications across the entire scale of architecture, from the vernacular to, you know, the high capital A architecture of like Heatherwick and Company, for example, or Bjarke Ingels. And it's really inescapable, regardless of whether you're dealing with high culture or low culture. And that sort of totalizing way of looking at it is rather dark, but at the same time links things that some people would consider disparate or discrete phenomena within the same kind of critical banner, which I think is necessary. So that the problems that make the McMansion ugly are the same problems that make the vessel something out of Black Mirror. They're all intimately related systemically to capitalism and neoliberal capitalism in particular. And so to make a critique of these things is to inherently make an anti-capitalist critique. And so it's kind of, McMansion Hall is kind of an interesting way of doing that, while also sort of making a cultural jokes and just like being generally funny, part of a broader project of sort of design literacy, which is how can we look critically at a house or at a building and in it see the world. And yeah, and all of the faults of the world.
There are some extraordinary images on here, and you know there are some extraordinary interiors as well as exteriors, aren't there, within the McMansion Hall world. I wonder, just whilst, so we've got about 10 minutes left, which is often some time that we ask anybody who's watching to send in any questions via the YouTube chat, and Ali and Sarah will relay them to us. So if you've got any questions brewing, do pop them in the chat, and then they'll come through to us, and we'll try and, or Kate will try and address them. We'll try and talk about them. But just as we're sort of doing that, I was wondering, so looking at your blog, which, you know, is brilliant. Why is the ceiling metallic? I don't know. Who knows? I'm scared of sand.
This house this house was so insane that.
Wow. And these are all about these are all the things you found online on real estate websites.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Some of them are some of the McMansion Hall posts are funnier than others. This one was pretty funny. This one was definitely humor heavy and less criticism heavy, because the house invites the humor.
It does. It really does. It's quite incredible.
It's really quite.
It's to haunt me.
I mean, it's terrifying, to be quite honest. This house actually terrified me in a way that most of them don't.
So, I mean, there are a couple of points in there. One, you were saying that you're often asked about the question of popular, and isn't it okay to be popular? And I guess in a sense, what you're suggesting in your analysis and critique of these is that this is an active critique of the forms of capital, not the individual taste of the people that are behind it. It's not a critique of the people that choose this. It's a critique of the way that capital as a form of logic has become so insidious into our design culture that its emergence starts to take on these quite extraordinary, bizarre, and almost sort of perverse extrusion, really, in a sense. So I can kind of see that as a kind of nice argument that you make. I also had a question a little bit more about the idea of criticism. So in here, maybe it's a little less obvious, but certainly in some of your writing, you do take a kind of, and I'm saying this a bit as a devil's advocate, but you take a sort of oppositional perspective to the architect. So this is, I guess, the role of criticism, and increasingly on social media and platforms that require you, I guess, as somebody working, to be quite vocal, quite vociferous about your opinions, to take quite a binary approach to some of these things. And I wonder, is criticism too binary? Does it allow the space to emerge where you might find a synthesis between ideas? There's a lovely kind of Greek term that one of my colleagues here introduced me to, which is the counterpoint to antagonism, which is agonism, which recognizes the sort of inherent value of your opponent's sort of being and position and argument, and engages with it not in an antagonistic sense but an agonistic sense, in a sort of still battles and still kind of engages in the argument, but holds it a bit more lightly, I suppose. So my question is there a risk of it becoming too binary?
That's an interesting question. And again, I think it goes back to that on social media, especially, we all want to be outraged, and the negative garners so much more attention than the positive. And like I said earlier, like, people rarely ever ask me what I like. They always ask me what I dislike, which I think also sort of creates a kind of binary, or like the illusion of a binary. And I think it's interesting to me with the project of criticism, again, I said is really an act of love, and it's a desire for architecture to be better, because I love architecture, and I think that there's a lot of architecture worthy of love, but at the same time, the opportunities for presenting some of those views are less than those of sort of like inherently sort of negative views. And McMansion Hell is negative, and it's a humor blog. It's sort of also a webcomic in a way. But also the goal of it, when you talk about the goal of the writing and of the blog is, I think, is sort of an inherently populist goal, which is not to say that, like, my taste is better than your taste, or taking sort of an elitist view of taste that, like, people often ascribe to the critic. It's how do we engage the public in a way that is, like, fun and interesting with their own sort of innate critical eye. And I feel like I've taught like 15,000 Tumblr teens what a dormer is. So it's a kind of like, how can we spread design awareness in a way that is not patronizing, that is fun and enjoyable, but also, inherently critical? And how can we develop a sort of the critical eye and encourage people to be their own architecture critics? Because, I mean, if we write architecture criticism just for other architecture critics, or just for the field of architecture itself, we're failing to do our duties as critics, as educators, as public figures, as public intellectuals. I mean, so much of that's why Ada Louise Huxtable, for example, was such a beloved critic, because she was funny. I mean, her columns in the New York Times aren't like about like obscure analyses of like how the Palladian is infused in the work of Philip Johnson or whatever. She was funny, and she brought sort of an air of whimsy and sharpness to architectural criticism that made it enjoyable for public consumption. And if she liked a building, the public would get really excited about it. And if she didn't, at least they had a good time reading about it. So she was the one who called Hudson Yards a collection of dildos, glittering dildos, in one of her last columns before she died. So I think that part of it is engaging with the public and to build a broader audience for design criticism, which is inherent to the critical project, which I think is ultimately, like, in a cultural sense, perhaps not a political sense, a populist goal.
Well, I suppose one of the things that humor does is it helps to burst bubbles, doesn't it? Humor can be something that can deflate an ego that might seem to kind of own or suggest that they have the understanding, the style, the taste. So a couple of questions have come in. We've got one from Merlin Fulcher, asking, isn't the overrated minimalism of some contemporary high architecture just as terrifying and ludicrous?
It's funny because, to me, I wrote an article about this recently for Hyperallergic called Normie Minimalism, which is like the infestation of minimalism sort of into popular, more broader design culture. And it's interesting to me how minimalism started as an experimental art movement in the 60s and 70s, and is gradually morphed into like a lifestyle, and then into like a vague aesthetic of sparseness. And I think it's interesting to me that for so much of minimalism, I always think about like the work of Kyle Chayka, for example, his essay, Welcome to Airspace, which everyone should read, which is about Airbnb and the proliferation of these mediums of technology, and how they proliferate like these sort of hegemonic aesthetics that are considered to be like in good taste and consumable. And it's interesting to me with minimalism how so much of it is predicated on not having things, and the people who can afford to not have things are people who can afford to like jet set from Airbnb to Airbnb all the time. And so it's really a kind of, despite like the sparseness and the aestheticism that's inherent in it, it's really a kind of aspirational aesthetic to not have things, to be liberated from things. And I think that in that way, in some ways, it does present sort of a complement, for example, to the McMansion, which is like an architecture predicated on the accumulation of things. And this sort of minimalism is also an aspirational architecture where one is liberated. One is materially secure enough to be liberated from a broader sort of material culture or from objects or from things. And so they're two sides of the same aspirational coin.
Another couple of questions have come in. So do you have any thoughts on Douglas Spencer and the Architecture of Neoliberalism?
I really like that book. I've read it, I think 2 years ago. 2018 is when I read it. And I read it let me pull it up. I was doing some research for a piece that I wrote, but I don't quite remember which one it was. But I really enjoy that book because I think it's an academic book, but it does a really good job of distilling the kind of ideological ethos behind sort of these contemporary architectures and how they relate politically to neoliberalism. I think it's a really useful book for analyzing those relationships. Big fan of Doug Spencer over here, is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same here. His analysis is pretty sharp. We have another from somebody brilliantly named. So that question before was from Michelle V. We have somebody called Rosamatron, which is the best name ever. I hope that's your real name, Rosamatron. It's a wonderful name. I'm interested to know what Kate hopes for the future of architecture's relation to capital, given how tied much of her critique is to a left-wing critique of capitalism's effects.
That's an interesting question because it's a political question. We can ask all day long, like, what would an architecture emancipated from capitalism look like? But we won't really know until we make steps in the direction, at least even within our field, towards building structures sort of outside of capitalism. And so, for example, like in the US, there's a big discussion happening with regards to like the unionization of architects and how, the structures, the legal structures of business restricts collaboration and restrict things like better pay and as a form of price collusion, for example, under antitrust law. There's a sort of a lot more research being done by people like Peggy Deemer, for example, whose new book I just read, Architecture and Labor, that goes on about what would these alternative structures look like. Is it co-ops? Is it unions? Is it nonprofits? Is it different like forms of contract law? Like in architecture, how can we create loopholes around sort of capitalism and the bigger question is like, what kind of formal effects would that have? Much less like relational effects as in terms of the internal culture of architecture. But so much of architecture's internal culture is predicated. Oh yeah. And the architecture lobby, of course. Big shout out to the architecture lobby, of which I am a member. And I think that a big question that has yet to sort of be answered or explored is, what does that look like formally? What will that look like? So much of architecture is entrenched inherently in like the laws that are built into sort of in America, like zoning laws, for example, or laws regarding the buying and selling of land. So we forget that architecture is a commodity. We always think of it as art separated in some sort of like oblige noblesse of the architect. But at the same time, it is a commodity. Buildings are objects to be bought and sold as much as we imbue meaning into them. And so like what would an architecture liberated from the restraints of financialization look like? I don't have the answers to that, and I don't think anybody does. But the best we can do is to, like, some architects, for example, like Peter Barber, dedicate themselves to providing for the public realm and for providing and see themselves as civic actors first and foremost, working for the public and for publicly owned or managed land rather than for private developers or for rich individuals. And so it's not so much, it's really about like sort of an internal resistance to these things rather than some sort of broader formal question of what will architecture look like liberated from capitalism. And so I think that's one of the most trying questions of our time. And now there's starting to be serious academic and political thought happening, and organizing happening within universities, within organizations like the Architecture Lobby, for example, that wasn't there before, and has asked these questions and are dealing with them in a very organized and political way. And we have to accept that these are political questions, and that they have political answers as well as, theoretical or academic or formal answers. So I guess that's not necessarily an answer to the question, but sort of an expository statement on it. I should hope that architecture after capitalism is really good looking.
Probably. We've got time for one final question, and we've got it's a kind of combined question from our very own Jose Figuera, who's here at the school. Would you consider McMansion Hell as part of the architectural meme sphere? Is it a word? It is now, Jose. A criticism that's been burgeoning in the past couple of years, sort of Dank Lloyd Wright, etc. And if not, do you reckon it still achieves or tries to achieve similar types of modes of criticism as those? Or do you see your project as engaging in very different methods or ways to meme culture?
I kind of think of McMansion Hell as being it's sort of an odd man out. It's really, McMansion Hell is really grounded in an earlier internet. Sorry, the chat. It's cycling questions. The McMansion Hell is really rooted in an earlier internet. It's really rooted in a kind of conception of the internet as like the internet when I came of age. So, like, for example, the era of blogs and webcomics, but webcomics specifically. And the way that it functions is much less sort of like a meme and much more sort of like a webcomic, or like those sort of like middle period of internet media productions that happened, around like 2007, 2008, 2009, sort of like right at the threshold between blogs and memes and social media. And so it's something to me that is in some ways like from an older internet, but also that sort of inherent image making element of it fits within a newer internet. And it's based on Tumblr, which is a social media site. And so in a way it is sort of a weird bridge between older and newer internet, but I wouldn't say that it's a part of like meme culture necessarily. Because it's too long form to be a meme. But as in terms of like, like Dank Lloyd Wright, actually, my favorite thing about Dank Lloyd Wright, which is an Instagram account that's like really funny about architecture, is that I feel like when I read Dank Lloyd Wright, like these are like the jokes that like about architecture that I have like been wanting all my life. And I find them to be like so funny. It's like, they feel like inside jokes that like maybe 50 people get, but they are actually quite popular. And they crack me up all the time. It's like, I'm like so happy that there's like a place on the internet where people can make like in jokes about Herman Hertzberger. Like that to me is just that, I'm telling you, that makes my day, because sometimes it feels like, being an expert or being in like a niche field is like so lonely and like so unfun. And then that account just like blows that open. It's like, yeah, actually we can just like laugh about these guys. Like we can have a good laugh about architecture. And the guys who run that account are really funny guys, and the posts are really, really funny. And I often find myself reading them and be like, damn, I wish I thought of that. Like, this is like, it's hysterical. It's so niche too. That's what's so funny about it, is that like it can be so popular and so niche at the same time, which I think is like something, it's an inherently interesting quality of memes, where it's like you have memes for like different careers and stuff like that. Like there's memes, for example, in America for like long haul truckers, and they're like these meme pages for long haul truckers which have like thousands of members on Facebook or something, and that's fantastic to me. I actually love that. I feel like it makes things like a lot less lonely. It's like, yeah, but so yeah, shout out to Dank Lloyd Wright for making me laugh pretty much every day. Like they make me laugh.
That's amazing. There's there's an amazing proliferation of humor, it would seem, as well.
I love it.
capital. So, you know.
I don't own being funny about buildings on the internet. People always ask me that, like, if some like Twitter account, like there's a Twitter account now called Cocaine Decor, which I find really funny, which is just like pictures of interiors that kind of look like people definitely did cocaine in there. And like all mirrored surfaces and stuff like that, like from the 70s. And people are like, oh, do you feel like this is like encroaching upon you or whatever? And it's like, do you think I own being funny about buildings in the internet? Do you think I want that to be like my sole responsibility? Like I've built my base, I've built my audience, I've built my, you know, platform, so to speak, over the years, and it's been legitimated, and I have my own, you know, professional life outside of it now. And so I don't have like that. I don't feel that same, I feel like it's antithetical to the open nature of the internet to be territorial about things like that. I think, I mean, I was someone who was like almost got sued for copyright infringement by a major company. Like, I really hate that, like, if someone else wants to be funny on the internet about buildings, like, more power to them. That's hilarious. Like, that's great. You know, like, that's great. Yeah. Please go be funny about buildings on the internet.
Well, on that point, hey, I was going to tell you my terrible architectural Christmas cracker joke, but I'm not sure it's broadcasted entirely across the world. Now I'm
intrigued.
I got it. What's a classical architect's favorite breakfast cereal?
Oh, I don't know.
Rococo Pops.
You're going to say Palladios.
Hey, well, that could be good as well. There's all sorts. Anyway, it's that's probably just cost me my promotion. That isn't going to ever happen, so that's fine. Anyway, let's leave it at that. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, Kate. Thank you so much for such a brilliant end to this experiment of a public lectures series. It's been a real joy. So yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been. I hope Chicago doesn't get too cold.
It will.
Well, and one time maybe we meet IRL. I suppose. Yeah, is that still a thing? People still say that, or am I like totally aging myself?
Definitely IRL. Okay. Yeah, for sure. That would be awesome.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Good night.
We'll stop the live stream.